All right, we're rolling. So,
Okay.
name, rank, date of service, and what you were doing in the military, job-wise.
My name is James R. Ferguson, and I was in the United States Coast Guard from 1970 to 1975. My rank was E4. I was an aviation machinist mate.
All right, so let's kick it on down to some stories from your service.
Well, the first story that may be of local interest to the Virginia Beach area is that after I got out of boot camp in Cape May, New Jersey, I came to a base called Berkeley in Norfolk, where they had a Coast Guard assignment. And the first thing that I did as a seaman was peel potatoes in the mess hall, and that got old real quick. And then they gave me an offer that I couldn't refuse. One day they said that they had an opening on the Chesapeake Light Tower. So I didn't even know where the Chesapeake Light Tower was, but if you stand on the boardwalk of Virginia Beach and look due east, right on the horizon you'll see a strobe light at night, and that is the Chesapeake Light Tower. It stood 130 feet out of the water, and it was the first navigational aid with radio beacon to guide ships into the port of Hampton Roads. I'd stand on the flight deck on the tower at night, and I could see the shoreline of Virginia Beach 17 miles away. And you stay out there long enough and you start thinking that you could take the motorboat that was attached to it and you could sneak off and go to shore, spend the night at Virginia Beach, and then get back before anybody missed you. But that was just a pipe dream, and it wasn't anything that ever happened. But that was a good assignment to be on the light tower. I was one of 4 people that were selected, and we used to fly out to the light tower on a Coast Guard helicopter. And the first time I ever got on a helicopter, I fell in love with it, and I knew that I wanted to go into aviation. So I applied to go to aviation machinist school to work on engines, and was accepted. And my school was in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, and it was quite an intense school. We learned about old Pratt & Whitney piston-powered engines. We started off on them, and then we worked our way up to T58 General Electric turboshaft engines, and T56 engines that were used on C-130s at that time. And after getting out of school, I applied for all kinds of different assignments. There were Coast Guard air stations back then in Naples, Italy, Guam. There were ones down in Homestead, Florida, in Kodiak, Alaska, and Barbers Point, Hawaii. And I applied to all of those stations and got Elizabeth City, North Carolina, which at the time I was disappointed because I wanted to see the world, but it ended up that Elizabeth City, North Carolina was one of the finest cities that I ever had the opportunity to live in. So while I was stationed at Elizabeth City, I started off working on C-130s, and I worked my way up to flight air crewman, got my wings, and I was a member of a search and rescue team on C-130s. One interesting trip that we took was we were on what was called the International Ice Patrol, and it was made up of NATO countries. And what we would do is we would go out and look for icebergs in the shipping lanes of northern America, between Nova Scotia, Greenland, Iceland, and all the way over to Ireland and down to the Azores. So we would scan for them. An interesting thing that happened was that we were internationally known as the aircraft that were looking for icebergs. So the Air Force had an idea that we could use our side-looking radar called SLAR that we use to find icebergs. And the SLAR would operate and could see to the side of the airplane 50 to 100 miles. And it was a very valuable tool. Also, it had an infrared capability, which was unique in those days, and it was the early days of infrared technology in military. And it would detect the difference between a warm object and a cold object. So, again, the Air Force had the idea that we could kind of hide under the guise of looking for icebergs, and we could go up into the Arctic and look for Russian satellite debris. Most of the satellites were polar satellites that would go around from the South Pole to the North Pole and circle the globe that way. And some of the Russian satellites had returned to Earth in the polar regions, and we were able to detect the difference in heat between the snow, which was below freezing, very much below freezing, and the reflective metal objects in the snow that drew heat from the sun. So they would show up in the infrared spectrum. And we did that. And we were successful. And that was quite an adventure for a 22-year-old guy to go up there. And one of those trips on the C-130s, we had a mission, and part of the mission was to resupply a Coast Guard radio station in the Baffin Islands at a place called Cape Christian. It's since been abandoned, but back in the days when I was in, instead of having GPS, we had something called Loran. And it did basically the same thing as GPS, but it was not nearly as efficient. And it was done with radio waves broadcast horizontally across space instead of down from a satellite. And the Coast Guard was tasked with managing the Loran system all over the world. We were supplying this remote outpost, and the only landing strip that was available was the beach. So we were going to land a C-130 on the beach to give these people, the Coast Guard station, needed supplies. And the snow had covered over a lot of eroded places in the sand on the beach, and it because of the snow and the wind, it looked smooth. And actually it wasn't. There were ruts and ravines 4-6 feet deep, but we couldn't see them. So when we came in for a landing on the beach, we hit one of those ditches and tore the main landing gear off of the aircraft and kind of spun around and slid to a stop. And I'll never forget the flight engineer. He was so calm about the whole ordeal. It was a tremendous impact. And he just said, looks like we've got a unsafe landing gear indication here, sir. And that was all that was said. So we offloaded our supplies, and we had to live in about 32 below zero conditions for about 2 weeks before they were able to retrieve us from that wreck. And right after that, I switched over to helicopters and became a helicopter aircrewman, and served out the rest of my career in search and rescue helicopters.
Do you remember that story you told me about you were in the chopper and there was like a fishing boat with a guy having cardiac?
Well, I don't know that this is the story that you're talking about.
You guys dropped a bucket down to the deck of the ship?
Mm-hmm.
That one?
Well, I did that many times. Guys having heart attacks on foreign vessels. One of the most interesting rescues that I had was a Lithuanian woman was pregnant and was delivering her baby. And they called us to come and get her and take her to the hospital. So we went there, and I put her in the litter, hoisted her up to the hospital, to the helicopter, and she delivered her baby en route to the hospital. And that was quite an interesting rescue. One of the other ones that we had that was incredible, that I thought it was incredible the way people act, was we had a houseboat that was sinking, and it was a man and a woman on it, and the man kept holding